Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of the Kitabi Karwan podcast. Today, I have with me one of my favorite authors, Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni. She has written some absolutely amazing books, and I have unfortunately not read all of them, but some of the ones which I've read are some of my absolute favorites. You must have heard of her through her popular books, The Forest of Enchantments and The Palace of Illusions, which have won multiple awards for their beautiful depiction of female character based point of views in their novels based about Indian epics such as the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. And also her new book, The Last Queen, about Maharani Jinder, has been making the waves. Without giving anything away, let's dive into the interview.
Hello and welcome to the Kitabi Karwan podcast, Dr. Divakaruni. I'm so glad you're here. It's been a very long time in the making, and I'm just super excited. And actually, more than me, a lot of my friends are because they're super fans of your work, and they've read. So that's actually that's my second question to you. The first one is a traditional question that I ask at the on the Kitabi Karwan podcast, which I asked for most authors. Could you tell us something about yourself or about your writing process or about you as a person that most of your readers won't know from what they find on the internet or from the blurbs of your book?
Sure. First of all, I'm really happy to be here talking to you. And, I think you're doing such a great job. So I'm very happy to be part of your podcasts. Something about me that people don't know. Let me see. I've been writing now for a number of years, so probably everything is out there on the internet. But I think maybe what people don't know is that I never thought I was going to be a writer. A lot of people know from the time they're young that they want to write. But I never thought I was going to write. I didn't think I had any talent. Nobody in my family really encouraged me because they all thought that, writers cannot make a living. So they were like, please choose something practical to do. And so I studied literature with an idea of teaching, and I teach. And I do love teaching. So I'm happy that I'm a teacher, especially a teacher of creative writing. But it was only after I came to the US that I felt a great deal of, missing India, homesickness. And I wanted to write about India. And that was also the time when my grandfather passed away. And I had been very close to my grandfather when I was growing up. So I think his death really made me want to commemorate his life in my writing. So I wrote a poem about him. And that was one of the first things that I wrote.
I am just surprised at the fact that I mean, it's difficult for me to imagine that at some point in your life, you or your family thought that you didn't have talent to write, because your work is absolutely riveting. I've read a couple of your books, and a lot of my friends have read a lot more of your work, and everyone is just taken away by the way you write. So I mean, it's I guess it's just a different journey therein. But that actually brings me to my second question. So I might be wrong here, but so a lot of the people who I know who are fans of your work have read most of your recent work, mostly the last three books that you've written: Palace of Illusions, Forest of Enchantment, and The Last Queen, which was fantastic, by the way. But so do you ever feel that your earlier work is generally disregarded given the success of your newer work, or the way these books have taken off, particularly in the Indian subcontinent? Or I mean, do you feel that this is some of your best work and that is why it deserves the appreciation?
It's a combination of both things. And also one has to realize that, ultimately it is quite mysterious why one book catches hold of the reader's imagination and another one doesn't, because obviously as a writer, I try to make each book the best I can possibly make it. So one of the reasons I think that Palace of Illusions and Forest of Enchantments particularly have really caught the public interest is because of the subject matter, which is it's taken from, these are the stories of our epics. This is the story of the Mahabharata, the Ramayana. This is the story of the women of these epics who have long been ignored. So Draupadi and Sita, and they are absolute icons in our culture, right? So the subject matter itself is of great interest to people, especially a retelling of that story. So I think that's part of the reason. And the same with The Last Queen. Obviously, it is a matter of great interest to us to rediscover a woman who has been forgotten by history, but who fought the British very, very bravely until her dying breath almost. So, right there, there's a lot of emotional resonance for readers in India. My other books I read a lot and studied a lot, but mostly in the academic context. So a lot of students are writing their master's or PhD dissertations on my books.
So, ma'am, again, I have a two-part question. The first one is, as you very rightly mentioned yourself, that The Last Queens is the subject of the book is one which is generally forgotten by history, while the previous two before that are perhaps the two most famous women in Indian history who have been the subject of those books. So, what brought about this change? Like the first two books, those two books being focused on a retelling, and this one being just rediscovering a forgotten thing. Was this a conscious choice you made? How did you end up picking this subject? And the other question I wanted to ask you was, as you mentioned that a lot of your work is generally studied on the academic front. Have you felt that over the past 20-30 years, over the time that your work's been examined, has there been just newer and more emerging, let's say, for a lack of a better word, criticism of your work that has come out? Or do you think it's just the same set of things that people have constantly analyzed, or there hasn't been a lot more fresh thought that's been put into it?
Yeah, I'll answer that second question first.
Sure.
So I think in recent years, there have been really very new and different ways of looking at my work, because often students who are doing their work, they will email me and they will say, I'm writing on this aspect or I'm researching this aspect. And I see that the subject matter has changed a lot. So first there was much more of, a post-colonial kind of lens through which people were looking. What does this work say about India in the post-colonial era after independence? But now there's a lot more looking at women's roles. There's a lot more looking at imagery. There's a lot more about immigration. There's just a lot of other things about women's agency. So I can see that as time goes by, academic emphasis is put on different things, which is very nice, because then people are bringing up different aspects of the writing, and it's much more valuable for readers who will come later, who will be reading those dissertations or doing research. Yeah, I'm very pleased to see how people have gone off on different aspects of the writing. There are some aspects that one person did a whole dissertation on father figures in my books. That was quite different, right? One did one on the role of food in my books. Right. So, very different kinds of things.
Right.
Yeah. And then you were asking something about the other books?
Right. Ma'am, what made you choose choose Jinder Kaur as the subject of your last book, given that the two books before that were focused on the most famous women in Indian history and was a retelling of their story rather than just rediscovering their stories?
Right. With the Palace of Illusions and the Forest of Enchantments, I had been thinking about writing those books for quite a while, because it always seemed to me that the women in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana have been ignored, right? We don't get as much about them, or if we get an interpretation of them, it's very much from the male gaze. And in the scenes where we see them, it's really the focus is always on the men. And as I was growing up, even as a teenager or a college student, I used to think about these women, and I used to think, well, but what were their lives like? what were they thinking? What were they feeling? Why did they do certain things? And so those thoughts were in my mind for a long time. I wanted to write those books for a long time. But I really felt that I had to become a good writer before I could handle such a big topic. So, those books I'd been thinking about for, I don't know, 10, 20 years,
Oh, wow.
So for about 10 years before I wrote Palace of Illusions, I was thinking about it. From that time, I was thinking about Forest of Enchantments. That took me another 10 years to write because I wanted to do the right amount of research. I wanted to really understand the characters. So those books, in some ways, probably were my most challenging books because, I'm writing in the tradition of that epic. And I wanted to do a good job. I wanted to respect the original, but also make it clear why my way of looking at the character is valuable and necessary. I really had to do a lot of thinking. But once those two were done, I felt that project was complete. And now I wanted to do something very different. And I really came across Maharani Jinda's story. I did not know her either because, like we were saying a little earlier, history kind of has ignored her, which is true of many important queens in history also. Again, history is another place where women are sometimes, why sometimes, often ignored. But this was a different kind of project. When I came across a story, it was really through the painting, which then later became my cover, the cover of my book.
Right,
and it is a painting, one of the few paintings that are available of her. And it is a painting that her son, Dalip Singh, had commissioned when she was in England, almost at the end of her life. But when I saw that painting, I was really struck by how, she has such a strong face, and you can tell that this is a person who has gone through a lot of ups and downs. She has faced a lot of danger and difficulty, and yet she's very resolute. So when I came across that uh, painting, I wanted to find out more about this woman. And then when I started reading about her life, I thought, this is an amazing subject. This is an amazing person from whom we can learn so much. And even other than that, she has an amazing story. She was the daughter of a kennel keeper. And then she becomes Maharaja Ranjit Singh's favorite queen. That itself, I mean, there must have been something amazing about her for him to make her into his queen. So that got me interested.
And that's fascinating to know that, it took you 10 years to come up to, go through with the Palace of Illusions and the Forest of Enchantments. Because, so in my very limited experience, something that I actually learned recently is that one of my friends, her mother and her grandmother, all three of them have read the book. Her grandmother actually read a translation, I think a Gujarati translation of the Palace of Illusion. Then all three of them share a genuine appreciation for the book and developed a better bond because of the fact that they could bond around the book. And as you mentioned, I think history is. I would actually go beyond often, and it's I think in 99% of the situations has just ignored women and the role that they play. And so again, that just gets me to another two-pronged question. The first one being, do you think uh, this comes across as a burden as well now in your career, given that you have written three books now, which have been have leading female protagonists depicting how histories wronged them or at least ignored them, given them a voice, and that puts a burden on you to have the so-called right narrative in that sense, you know the perfect liberating uh, uh, a narrative. I'm not too sure if I'm bringing my question across right, so I'll try to elaborate in it. Right. So in today's world, we look at how people have their in a world of cancel culture, you have to be absolutely right on liberal things, or you're just ignored by the masses, or the masses come after you for not knowing the right things or not doing things the right way. Given that you're a writer and obviously who should be allowed the leeway and have the subjectivity of writing her characters the way she wants, do you think this burden somewhere sits at the back of your mind that, oh, maybe if I write this character in this way or give her this particular voice, there would be a certain backlash that I'll face, or it won't be accepted, and it might result in my work being attacked. And the second prong is quite similar, but it just extends to how, and this is something I burden, I guess, any author who is Indian by origin but isn't a resident of the country, somewhat faces throughout their life, I guess, is that do you feel a burden to be the flag bearer of the culture that you represent, to the extent that and do you at all face certain backlash about not being a true despite, because of the fact that you've not been here for a while? Do you feel attacked at certain point of time by your audience or by certain people about not being able to represent your culture properly?
Those are very good questions. So the first one is that, when I was writing these 3 books particularly, I was quite concerned because, writing about the Ramayana, writing about the Mahabharata, and going on a path that is not traditional, which these books are not, because they have already, just by putting women in the center, I have made them non-traditional. So I was worried. And, these women, in both cases, Sita and Draupadi, they are quite outspoken. They're courageous women. They say whatever they feel is wrong. So, sometimes they are criticizing the men, the heroes. They're criticizing ways in which things are done to them. So I was concerned, yeah. So the way I dealt with it is by doing as good a research as I could, so that if people pointed to something, I could immediately point back and say, look, I got this from this older epic text. I didn't just make it up. Here is the exact incident. I have just changed the interpretation because now it is being seen through the female gaze, but this thing exactly happened the way Draupadi says it happened, or the way Sita says it happened. I didn't make up anything. So, this is authentic. I could say that. With Maharani Jinda also, I tried to do the best research that I possibly could. And, I was aided by the fact that she's a very charismatic character and her life is full of drama. So I didn't have to make up anything. I just presented the drama as it was. And in all these cases, I want to show these women as, real life characters. I loved the story you said about the grandmother, mother, and the daughter, all in the same family reading the book. That is like my hope and my wish, that the books will transcend generations. They will cause conversations in families and among friends and in different genders also. That is my great wish for these books, because I think books really have an opportunity to bring us together. So that is my hope. But yes, am I worried when I write a book? Yeah, I'm always a little worried because, you have to, if you're going to write a book that's strong, you really have to stand up for certain things. For instance, in Maharani Jinda's life, we know from historical sources that many years after she became a widow, when she is queen regent, she has a lover. Okay. So if I don't put that in my book saying, oh, what will people think? Then it defeats my purpose of trying to tell the story of her life truthfully. It also defeats my purpose, which is to show that we can't hold women to like these impossible standards. Should they not be women who have desire? Should they not be women who feel lonely? Should they not be women who do all the things that men are doing? Why do we put this burden on them? So I've shown her to be a character who is complex and who has her faults. And that's perfectly okay because she's human, right? But was I worried that maybe some people will take it wrong? That's always a worry. But at the end of the day, you have to say to yourself, if I'm doing something that is truthful and I'm doing it for the right purpose, then I have to take that risk. And at least, by God's blessing, so far, things are okay. The positive comments are certainly way, way more than, there'll always be one or two people who disagree with you, and that is fine. They have the right also to disagree. So, and then you asked another question. Remind me of that
Yes,
second one.
So, ma'am, it was a similar question, but larger in the context of, say, the Indian culture, given
Oh,
that.
right. Okay, I remember now. So, yeah, so that's always also an issue because, of course, I mean, until COVID, I was coming back to India very regularly. And I still have, family, relatives, lots of friends in India, which is why I'm so concerned at this time as at what is happening with COVID in India. But yeah, but also the thing is that I'm not writing about current India. If I were to set a novel in today's India, I really think I would have to spend a lot more time in India doing research. But because I'm writing about other times, that world is not in India right now anyway. That is a world of the past that has to be researched. Yes, it lives in us. Those ideas are still very important to us. They're in our blood, but they're not physically there in our country right now. So I don't feel that physically being away is a problem, especially, in fact, when I'm writing a historical novel. I found this out when I was writing The Last Queen. Because of COVID, I could not go to places to do research, which otherwise I would have done. I would have gone to Kolkata, for example, because that is where Maharani Jinda meets up with her son, who has been taken away to England. 14 years later, she will see him, and they will have their, reunion in Kolkata in a historical hotel. So if it hadn't been for COVID, I would have gone to Kolkata most probably to just look at the place. But in a way, it is better I did not go because I could only look at paintings or photographs or read accounts of that time. So I was more immersed in that time. I didn't have a modern, you know what I'm saying? A modern, I don't know, a conflicting image to look at. I could focus on that time. So actually, for the older books, I think it is not a disadvantage. It might even be an advantage. Now, if I'm going to write anything else, if I'm going to write something contemporary, then I really have to research, and I would go and see places, talk to people, spend some time living there, trying to understand. And of course, there are books. Books help me understand and keep current with what's going on in India. So, the purpose is, I think, a positive one, a good one, to write those stories, to make them real and alive and authentic. And that's the best that I think, at least from my point of view, any writer can do. Are there going to be people who are going to do backlash things? There's always going to be people like that. At a certain point, you have to say, in my eyes, according to my values, I'm doing the right thing. I'm not doing it for any negative purpose. I'm not doing it for any purpose of exploiting Indian culture in any way.
Ma'am, in your answer, something that I actually picked up, and is something that was, I know, it's an observation perhaps I've made in the writings of people or like of Indian origin who write about India, is somehow that their observational skills sharpen a lot more compared to Indian authors. So an Indian author would rather focus more on the story, and again, it's just one of my personal understandings of things. But most Indian origin authors, they would delve on things, exploring the nuances of things, how things taste, how they felt, how they looked, which I guess it just, being away from the land kind of just brings out those memories. As you said, it runs in your blood now to that extent. But ma'am, now I'll just come to a bit more technical side of things as to what's your writing process like? Like, how do you go about from conception to finalizing the project? How do you come up with the ideas and choose what you wish to write on, and then how do you go about the entire process?
Well, I have a writer's notebook. So anytime I come across or an idea comes to me, I write it down. Before, I used to have a paper notebook, but now it's electronic. It's on my computer. And anytime I come across ideas, I will write them down. I'll jot down everything I think about the idea, and I'll leave it there because usually I'm in the middle of writing something else. But that'll then be in the back of my mind. So I have maybe, 5, 6, 7, 8 ideas. And then as I'm getting towards the end of the book that I'm working on right now, I will then look back and one of those ideas will start to resonate. That's how often it's done. It comes to me. But in the case of Maharani Jinda, I saw that painting and it was so powerful that I felt that I had to make this the next book. So actually, I was writing a different book and I put it aside. I put it aside and I said, I really have to write this book. There was a really strong need, as it were, to write it. So they all come in different ways, but it's so exciting when an idea comes. That's my absolute favorite part of writing, that all of a sudden an idea will come and then it'll be in the back of the mind. And then, I'll jot down a few things and I'll put it aside maybe because I'm working on something else. But then in between, it'll keep coming up and it'll form a little more and a little more and a little more until then I'll have somewhat of an idea. I'll know the main characters. I'll kind of have the story arc. And then I'll start doing serious research on that.
Right.
So that's how my writing process works.
No, and I think almost everyone, not just writers, I think can associate with that thrill of that new idea, whether it's just about writing or just doing something new. I think that in general forms the most exciting part of anything at all. Like to be honest, like the very idea of even contacting you in the first place was the most thrilling bit for me. That I will do this. But ma'am, so
yeah, it's quite amazing, isn't it? Because when I think of it, where does that idea come from? It's very mysterious.
Exactly.
How does it arise in us? How do ideas come? Sometimes I'm fascinated.
Something about that, like you mentioned that strong vibe about you just saw the painting and you set aside a book that you were working on to write simply because that painting spoke to you. I mean, where does that come from? It's just that.
Where does that come from?
Yeah, that part of the human experience, which is just amazing, absolutely amazing, to be honest. But ma'am, that brings me to the next, I know, maybe interesting, maybe not, question that as a writer or as a part of your writing process, do you think you have any quirks? Because I've spoken to authors who have some do have some odd quirks about writing at particular times, or they read their work back to themselves in different voices to kind of get a hang of things, including one of the authors that I spoke to. One of her characters was a 3-year-old child, so she actually used to baby speak her lines to kind of just get a hang of how the character would sound to people. So along those lines, what are your quirks about your writing process?
Well, they have changed over time. I think over time they've become less and less because I realize that, the writing process is quite mysterious, and really what one has to do is just be quiet and give oneself quiet space to allow those things to come out that come from mysterious sources. But I remember I have an earlier book that was also very successful, Sister of My Heart. It was made into a film. It was made into a TV show in Tamil. It was translated into Tamil and it won 5 awards. It was made by Suhasini Maniratnam. Anyway, it became a big international bestseller also. And it's in 2 voices, and they're 2 cousins, and they kind of grow up together. And their voices are very different. And I remember that when and they have each 1 chapter at a time. So I had to constantly shift between the voices. And I remember each time I would start a new chapter, I had to speak aloud in the words and try to get just the tone of it right before I could get into the chapter, because I had to completely change the speaking style and tone. So I remember that for that book. But after that, I didn't have to ever do that again. And that book required a particular technique. Nowadays, I think all I really need is some undisturbed time and a place where I can be quiet. I write in my study, and I just ask my family, I just tell them I'm going up to write, and generally they will leave me alone to write for a while. And that's pretty much all I need. What I My recent books have focused more and more on research, so I
Right.
do need good research sources, which again during COVID was a big challenge.
So, ma'am, so are you a proponent of the school of thought that writing should be a technical process wherein, so there are contrasting views on this, because there'll be a lot of people who just be somewhat like Hemingway, like you just sit and you let the words flow through you, and then that's what constitute what your work is. And there will be some people who'll be like, no, it's a as a process, as you mentioned, and you research, you put your head to it, you take out some time and you write, and you can turn it into something worth publishing. So which one of the two do you fall into? Because in your process, I see a mix of both.
Yeah, I think it's a mix of both. You have to have the inspiration, otherwise, you can't write. So I think the first draft, when it comes out, it's much more like Hemingway, where it's just, hopefully pouring out of you, you're getting a sense of
Right.
the character and the voice. But I do a lot of revision after that.
Right.
So, because that first one, it has the energy and it has the feel of the character and the world, but
Right.
it doesn't yet have the shape and the structure. And it doesn't have, the many layers of narratives and other things that make books interesting. So I think all of that comes after my first draft is written, or sometimes I'll write, a chapter and then I'll go back and revise that chapter. So yeah, I like revision actually. So yeah, the coming up with the idea is exciting, the most exciting thing. And then writing it is a lot of hard work, but revision, I'm quite fond of revision. I have a group of writer friends and we share work with each other, and they always give me ideas. So they will read my books and they'll say, well, this is working, that is not working.
Right.
We think you should change it like this. Maybe you should take out this character. They give me all kinds of suggestions. I'll think about those things, and then I revise. So I really recommend the revision process for any people who are listening, who are interested in writing. All of my books, the books that people are so kind enough to say that they're wonderful books, they were not in that shape when they were first written. A lot of revision, polishing, restructuring, rethinking has gone into all of the books.
Ma'am, that actually, forgive me for being offensive here if I say this, but that's actually what a college professor would definitely always say. Revision is key, I guess.
Revision is
And when
key.
it comes
It
to
is.
submitting papers, it just took me back to my college days when one of my professors said something similar to me. That
Yes. Because what happens is that it when we compose, we're very close to the
Right.
work. Whatever, if it could be a college paper, it could be a story or a poem. We don't have any perspective at that point. We're just too close to it. And that's what I tell my students also. I say, put it aside for at least 1 week. And then when you go back to it, you yourself will see a lot more in it, because now you can see it more objectively. You
Right.
will see what is good and what needs work.
Right. I think the detachment from your work, right? Like it's something you've created, so it's obvious there'll be some bias immediately into it. And I personally believe that every moment in your life is that you're a changing person. So like something like you recommended, right? That 1 week away from your work, that person does gain some, as as small that perspective change in perspective is a change in perspective. So once they get back to it, obviously they'll be able to kind of look at their work in a different way. But ma'am, now I'll just flip the tables and go to the other side of your life. That is, as apart from being a writer, as I can see in the background, you're a voracious reader as well. So if you could just take us through how your journey of reading began. Like, with this start in your childhood? Was this something you picked up in school or college? How?
Yeah, reading has always been a big part of my life. Writing, as I told you, I only started writing after I came to the United States, and I was in doing my PhD and really finishing up my PhD when my grandfather passed away and I started writing. But reading, I always loved. Um, my mother tells me this. My grandfather he was a big reader. and he always encouraged me. We read a lot of books together. So I have always enjoyed reading. I think reading our myths and epics and fairy tales, folk tales, that was a big interest of mine as I was growing up. And all of those things have reappeared in my work in different ways. Of course, in the Palace of Illusions and Forest of Enchantments, but also in books like Sister of My Heart, where the two cousins grow up listening to a lot of old Bengali folk tales, and those kind of affect their ideas about who they are as women in their world, what is allowed to them, what is considered good for them. So that kind of reading continues to be of great interest to me. I've taken classes in folklore and mythology while I was in college, just because I wanted to learn more about that. But for fun, I love reading fantasy and science fiction.
Oh, wow.
So yeah,
That's
and
very
I have
interesting.
one trilogy of children's fantasy. It's
Yes.
called the Conch Bearer
Yes.
trilogy.
Yes.
So obviously that interest came into that book, appeared in that book. I love
Right.
stories about magic and all those things. So from the
Magic?
Lord of the Rings to Harry Potter, I've read a lot of
No. So
magic and fantasy.
I personally find it fascinating because it's very believable for me as a reader to find that you are interested in fantasy, because that kind of reflects in your work as well. But science fiction is something new. I mean, it's very interesting to know that you're into science fiction. But ma'am, if I were to ask you, obviously not to name your favorite books, because I get that it's not a straightforward answer ever for anyone for that matter. But has there been a book or a few books or an author who has impacted you a lot in, maybe not necessarily as a writer, but just as a person, has transformed
Well,
your
and
experience?
yeah. I think the writer probably who has influenced me were two writers really influenced me, because I read their books early on. I read them. One I read even before I got to college, and one I read in college. So they have really had an impact on me. And interestingly, they are both male writers, because otherwise, and then I will give you names of several women writers who have influenced me. But the earliest influences were from Tagore. And because I'm Bengali, I grew up reading Tagore in Bengali, in the original. And that is just a beautiful experience. And he is so complex. He is so insightful. I felt that Tagore really understood his women characters, and the way he has portrayed his women characters shows how much sympathy he has for women and their challenges in society. So I learned a great deal from reading Tagore, especially books like Home and the World, which now, many years later, I teach it in my classes, because I feel my students who are learning to become writers can get so much from that book. And the other person whom I came across in college was Tolstoy. And his book, Anna Karenina, especially had a big effect on me, because, again, he was so insightful in the ways in which society runs and how society treats women, especially if a woman steps outside of the accepted role, then what happens to her? So Anna Karenina, she has a lover. And once she decides to go down that route, she loses everything. Her husband takes away her child. So I think that book just created a huge impact, so that you see her, her downward spiral of her life. And at least for me as a reader, I felt so much sympathy. And I think it really got me interested in women's issues. So
That's, I mean, again, that's again a very fascinating bit that you pointed out, that that surprisingly was two male authors who stood out for you, in at least in your earlier reading years. But I think that's not some, but as you again pointed out, it's their sympathy that stood out for you, like the way they understood society, or the way they. So ma'am, you mentioned that you used to read a lot with your grandfather. So was it with him that you read the epics, or was he the one who introduced
yes,
you to?
yes, definitely. He introduced me to like the children's versions of the epics and the folk tales, the Bengali folk tales. And he taught me, he used to love all the old stories like Jatak tales and, all uh, Panchatantra tales, all of those traditional stories. We are so blessed in our culture that all those stories are available for children also in the child form. So he always used to give me books for my birthday, and then we would read them together. And so I have a lot of happy memories. And as I grew up and got married and had children of my own, that was a big part of our home tradition, is reading together. And every night before the children would go to sleep, I would read to them. And I really think I learned all that from my grandfather.
And that's such a sweet memory to hear of, because personally, I think that goes for a lot of Indian readers, that their first experience with Indian epics and classic stories is either through either a parent or a grandparent who are telling them these tales or reading it with them. Like for me, it was with my mother, and luckily, this is one place where I would love to acknowledge Uncle Pai and Amar Chitra Katha. Like they have been so instrumental in, I think, getting people at least my age or at least a few years older than me to transition into this world of reading and connecting with our culture. It's just absolutely beautiful. And obviously, like,
I agree. I agree with you. And even though we were living here in the United States, I went to India and I bought many children's books, folk tales, Amar Chitra Katha. I got a lot of them. Yeah.
No, and ma'am, in that context, I think your work is very interesting. That particularly stands out for me. I mean, it's not just that they're interesting, unique retellings, but it's I've personally noticed this, that it's managed to reignite, I guess, this interest in these stories for people who would generally not be, right? Because it's just rather unfortunate that in India people still don't read as much as, at least in my personal opinion, I would love for people to read more in this country. But I've seen people who weren't interested in reading, but your work was the one that actually got them into reading. So I mean, I think in that sense, it's a great role that you've played.
Well, I just feel very thankful. People do write to me from time to time, and they say that, especially Palace of Illusions, which came out, like, I don't know, 13 years back. And at that time, there wasn't much being written about Indian epics or Indian mythology. So they say that, many people say that that was the first epic book that they read in modern form and that they could relate to as modern Indians. So I just feel very thankful. I had no idea when I was writing it. I was really writing it because I felt this great need to write it. That was all.
Well, ma'am, that brings us to the end of the interview, but I have one question for you before you go. What's your next work that's coming out? What's next can we see from you? What was that unfinished book that you left during the last Queen? That what's coming?
No, actually, I'm not going back to that unfinished book. That will have to wait a little bit more, because after writing about Maharani Jinda, I got very interested in the whole arc of the British in India. So in Maharani Jinda's lifetime, in The Last Queen, that is when the British are really powerful in India and they're taking over, right? In The Last Queen, they take over the most powerful kingdom in India at that time, which is the Kingdom of Punjab. Right. So I wanted to trace that story to its end. I wanted to write a book about when the British are forced to leave India and what happens then. So my next novel is set around independence.
Wow. Yeah, that'd be that's going to be a very interesting read, ma'am. That's a very fascinating subject that you've picked up, and I'm really looking forward to whenever this book comes out, and probably we can have a conversation then as well after that book comes out. But thank you for doing this, ma'am. This was a beautiful episode. I genuinely enjoyed this conversation. I'm pretty sure my listeners would have loved this as well.
Thank you so much. And I want to say a big hello to all our listeners out there. And, I love to connect with the readers on social media, as you probably know. So, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, it's a great way for me to hear from readers what they get out of my book. So I encourage everyone to join us.
Well, you heard her. You can reach out to her. Please send her your questions and your feedback. She would love them. I think ma'am would love to hear from every one of you. But thank you so much for doing this, ma'am.
Thank you. You had great questions, Siddharth.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you did, please check out all our other work on our Instagram page and on our YouTube channel. You can check out our podcast on different platforms. Follow, like, share, and subscribe.